All right, so good morning again. So like I mentioned, today it's a little bit different as I have to hand in an assignment to my teacher, and so I had to write an essay, and with the essay comes a creative component, and I was hoping to do it at LaSalle. That didn't work out, so he gave me a one-day extension to be able to preach it to you this morning. And so in my essay, the essay was on perseverance and going through Hebrews, and really digging into that. In my essay, I quoted someone, and he really wanted me to dig deeper into what the other person quoted. Now, I didn't in my essay because they were a secular psychologist. And so I quoted them. It was more along the lines of, hey, isn't it awesome that they're saying something similar to the Bible? But he wanted me to dig deeper, and so I spent most of yesterday reading the entire book that they had written called Grit. It's from Angela Duckworth, and she's a psychologist, and it was all about tenacity, perseverance, and what she calls grit. And then the more I read, the more I realized I'm sitting here and I'm like, my goodness, this lady probably went to school for a very long time, and she says everything my Bible has said already. And not just the entire Bible, but very specifically Hebrews, which is what my essay was on, and I was kind of giggling because I was just like, my goodness, they've been saying this for so long. She should have just read Hebrews, 13 short chapters, and you would have learned a lot. And instead, she has a lot more hands-on experience. But let me start off with Hebrews was written, we're not sure by who. There's different theories on all kinds of different people. But it is most definitely towards Jews who have turned Christian. And they're in the midst of massive persecution. And so because of persecution, and we know they're going through persecution because the entire encouragement of, there's a different word for it that I can't remember right now, but Hebrews was written to encourage. Because they were going through. And so that generally kind of narrows down a little bit of a timeline, somewhere around 70 AD, could be prior, could be afterwards, because first the Jews were rising up because they didn't like the Roman rulers, and so they were known as troublemakers, and then slowly this new movement called the Christians were doing something similar, and so they were starting to be targeted. And so they were coming under persecution, which I find interesting because if someone came to persecute you for what you believed, it's a simple matter of saying, yeah, I don't believe that. And they leave you alone, isn't it? Right? For a Jew, it would have been like, yeah, I could just say I don't, but I could still. But no, if it's what you believe, if it is who you are, then you need to stand up for it. And so they did. And so for people that were Jews and then became Christian, it was like, can I go back to being a Jew? Or maybe let go of everything because this is getting very difficult. And so Hebrews is written to encourage, to say, hey, remember your first love. Remember the first moments you gave your heart to the Lord and how much you were willing to suffer for him. And don't let that shake you. Don't let that change. And it's all about enduring, about holding on, about standing firm, and that's what it's about. And so that's who it was written for. And so I'm going to do a little bit of I'm going to go back and forth, dancing between what Angela wrote as a psychologist and then what our Bible says and how it says something similar, and quite specifically in Hebrews. So grit, as she dubs it, has 4 categories. And so they are interest, practice, purpose, and hope. And so those were the 4 things that I didn't fully include in my essay that he wanted me to jump into. So here we go. Interest. We must first of all follow our passion. That entails discovering what our core passions are. This process involves curiosity, trying new things, experimenting, and actively seeking to develop and stay with our interests. And so she dedicates an entire chapter to interest and how when she goes to interview some of the greats, it's like, so how did you get into what you got into? And when she went to some of the sports people, they were like, I, in this order, did basketball, baseball, football, soccer, and then I finally went into swimming, and then swimming is what stuck. And so she talks about how people started with an interest, but they weren't entirely sure about it, and then tried another and another until finally they found something that they could grow a passion for. And then how important it was that they actually had parents or mentors that cared enough to say, hey, let's give this a try. She gives like various examples. There's a gentleman who loved like engineering and things and mentioned that he liked listening to music while creating things. His entire garage ended up being like a laboratory for him to create and invent things. And so mom like bought a guitar, and she put it, he had a bunk bed, so put it on the top bunk, he slept on the bottom and left it there for 8 months. At the end of 8 months, she picked it up and brought it back because he never used it. But the opportunity was there to sit and say, hey, if this is a passion you may have, then explore it. And then talks about how he like took over the whole garage trying to create different things and what that looked like. And she goes into like various people who are like, so I mean, she talks about Jeff Bezos. She talks about like some pretty big names out there and how they became what they became. And a lot of them have a similar origin story where they were encouraged to try something different. There's one example given, I can't remember all the names off by heart, but they would go to Radio Shack like 4 times a day as he was trying to invent and create things. And it's like, oh, I need another piece. Oh, I need another piece. And you know, once your TV gets taken apart, your toaster gets taken apart, your microwave gets taken apart, it's like, so maybe you think we could put them back together, right? But it's all about finding that passion. And it's all about finding that interest and then sticking with it. And you'll remember that the next part talks about practice, so we'll get into that in a moment. But when it comes to passion, this is what science has to say. Passion for your work is a bit of a discovery, so it's something you need to find, followed by a lot of development. So once you find it, you got to stick with it, right? Because, I don't know, have you guys ever had an interest where you began that journey and then realized, oh, this is a lot harder work than I may have thought. I'm not sure I'm going to continue doing this, right? And it's about sticking it through. So even for me, as a pen maker or wood turner, my wife introduced me into turning spindles. I don't know if any of you guys know what a drop spindle is. It's another form of spinning wool into yarn. You can have the big wheel, and those generally go from like $2,000 to $1,000, $200 to like $1,000 and up. My wife had 3 of them. But when she first began her journey, she was like, "Can you make these like little wooden cylinders with a dowel inside and a hook?" And you would put it through the hook over the dowel, wrap it around the dowel once, and then you would do this with your fingers, and it would start spinning, and you let it drop to the ground. That's why it's called a drop spindle, right? And then as you release the wool, it slowly starts spinning it into yarn. And so she was like, "Can you make these for me?" And I started creating them. And then she's like, "Well, could you also make some bowls? Could you also?" I'm like, because I had bought myself a lathe. And so I had to YouTube, because YouTube teaches you everything these days. YouTube, what tools I needed, what like motors are good, what chucks are good to hold the wood, and slowly I started to create all kinds of things. And then my wife started doing craft shows, and she asked me, "Hey, can you like maybe include some stuff in the show?" And what? So I would make buttons and the spindles, and then I started pen making. And at some point in time when I started pen making, believe me, there were a lot of failures. A lot of times where I'm like, I'd love to create this bowl, and then my gouge would like grab it the wrong way and it would explode. I'm like, great, there goes, like $30, $40 worth of material, there it goes. There were frustrating moments when you have a pen and you're like all excited, and then you go to sand it and then realize there's a big hole in it. You're like, well, this is kind of useless, right? And there are moments where you can be totally defeated. And so to continue on in your interest requires a little bit of discipline, requires you a little bit more to go. And so passion, here's what science has to say. Passion for your work is a bit of a discovery, followed by a lot of development and then a lifetime of development, right? So it's something that you say, I like this, and you try it, and it's like, ooh, this isn't as easy as I thought, but you push through it, and then it takes a lifelong time developing. As in, it never ends. You never become a full master. Even masters always try to increase their knowledge, always try to do and be more. Interest requires the freedom to explore. I think I mentioned that a little bit with the parents that allow you to do what you need to do. And it is incredibly important for like the beginning and early years of like development of what you plan on doing. All of this makes me giggle because I think of the way God made me. And everything that she had mentioned concerning about finding your interest and your passion and I'm like, yeah, that's identity. That is who you are. What you're trying to do is figure out who you are, what you enjoy. And that's usually based upon what God has placed in there. God has placed everything that you enjoy, you like, somewhere deep down in your heart. I've always loved hockey. I didn't get to play it as a kid. I mean, out on the street, but I wanted to do ice hockey and did not get a chance until I was 23. And then when I did, I was playing 10 games a week. I got paid. It was $40. I was a rent-a-goalie. It was great. But it was something that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It was a passion that God placed inside of me. And I'm like, well, why did God put this here? And so the way I started into hockey is my church was doing shinny. They were, a bunch of the older gentlemen were gathering together to play, and they wanted a goalie. And I was just like, I could do that. And it was great because when I first started, I had road hockey equipment, which is mostly sponge, and pucks are hard. And I'd come home with these big yellow welts all over me, and I was just like, oh my goodness, but I love to play. And I realized that God placed that in there for a reason. Every passion, every interest you have is like God breathed. He knows the intricate parts he made in you and did it on purpose so that you could reach certain people that no one else can just because of the way that you're wired. And so when it comes time for identity, when you know who you are in God, everything else seems to fall in place, right? It was fantastic because years later when someone had rented my services, and I started enjoying playing with them, and I said, stop paying me, I'll just play for you from now on, if this is going to be a weekly thing anyways. But here's the condition, I'd like to pray with the team before we go on. And I gave honor to God, right? It was a passion he placed in me, and I found a way to give glory to God. And it was, I don't know, it was exciting the way God did that. But it's all based on identity. And so when I think of identity, I think first and foremost that we're children of God. We belong to him. All of who we are, all that we are is like he has created. And then when I think of like purpose and why we were created, I'll read you the verses in a moment. When I think of why we were created, it's again, and I've said this many weeks, but let's throw it out there, to love God and to love other people. Our identity is wrapped up in that. And then I put down on there that God, as he accepts you as one of his children, also disciplines you. So this is in Hebrews. For the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as his child. As you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his own children. So first and foremost, I'm a child of God. That means he's got the blueprints. When he created me with intent, with purpose, with, need to put this here, spare part. Sorry, my wife sometimes gets spare parts when we get IKEA stuff, and I'm like, hon, I'm not so sure it comes with spare parts. But he's got the blueprints, and he has intention for what you are to do. And the only way you begin to know that is understanding that you're a child of God. You belong to him. When you realize you belong to him, then you can start asking him and say, okay, why did you make me? What's the point of life? What do you need me to do? How can I serve? How can I? And you go through the exact same process that she was talking about. You look for interests. You look for passions. You look for, and so I was intrigued that Angela is like, when you first become a Christian and you realize, whoa, my worldview, the way I saw things, my purpose, the reason why I work, the reason why I, is all completely changed in light of the fact that I'm a child of God. And all of a sudden now with everything changed, you begin an exploring process, a discovery, like she said. You begin discovering who you are and what God made you to do. And when you start figuring it out, then you give glory and honor to God. And it's actually quite an exciting journey. I'm not saying it doesn't come without its pains, because it totally does, in the same way that she talks about development, right? Because then God's going to develop you and that passion and that interest that he put in there to begin with, right? I mean, take a look at Moses. Moses knew he was where he didn't belong. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace for 40 years and then realized that he didn't like what was going on with his people. And he did something about it. That didn't work out so well. He murdered someone, and then he ran away for the next 40 years. But then God came back and said, okay, now that you've wandered around for 40 years doing what you want to do, I have heard my people, and I'm going to do something about it. Now I'm sending you. And I always laugh at that part because I think Moses is sitting there, yeah, God, do it. Yeah, it's about time we do something about this. And then he's like, and now I'm sending you. Wait, what, me? you know? And then Moses began this refining process because he's like, but my words, but I'm not good at this. And he had to keep going back to Pharaoh saying, let my people go, let my people go. And a plague would happen. And it was like a discipline, a refining process where he's like, Lord, I'm scared to go to that big guy over there who he used to hang out with as a kid. Like, I committed murder. He could kill me. You know, like, I'm scared to go over there. And I'm making a demand to let his slaves go. Like, what if he takes me out? Or what if this happens? Or what if that happens? And the Lord's like, I'm going with you. You're not on this on your own. But he had to learn trust. He had to be refined. His interest was in letting the people go. So was God's, right? But he had to be refined. And you look at his journey in the wilderness. You look at his journey like right up to the end of his life. And it's all about his growing trust with God and dependence on God and leading other people into it. But same thing. God places interest, passion inside of us for a reason, for us to cultivate that and grow and develop it. So what else did I put up there? Hebrews 12, 6-7, we're all children of God. We belong to him. Therefore, we were created for his purposes. And then there's the whole point of loving each other and loving God. So Hebrews 13:1, keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. So our purpose, why we were created, we were meant for relationship. That is a core of what we all have to do. Like, we were meant to love each other, and we were meant to love God. Hebrews 10:22. Let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. And so there it is. The very things, like I said, that she had talked about in finding interest, and finding identity, and finding like that purpose, that beyond. I'm like, Bible has said it a long time. Now I'm quoting Romans. I'm skipping out of Hebrews for a moment just because I felt like this one's perfect for wanting to know what God's will is for your life. Romans 12:2, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you'll learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. There you go. Let God change you. Let that change happen. When you get to know him, you get to know him more and more, and you surrender yourself to him. Instead of losing your identity in that surrender, you in fact gain it. You realize that you are a child of God, and then you figure out what his will is for you. Specifically for you, and you get to develop that. All right, number 2 that she wrote is practice. No one likes this part. I totally admit, I have a violin downstairs in Sault Ste. Marie. I was taking violin lessons. I've always wanted to learn an instrument. I'm not generally musically inclined. I really enjoyed practicing, and I was learning and growing. And then I came here, and there was no teacher here. And without a teacher, I kind of just gave up. And this past week, Mr. Rowley, who orchestrates everything at LaSalle, said, well, why'd you give up? And I'm like, well, I don't have a teacher. And he goes, so, but do you play on your own? And I'm like, well, without telling me what I'm doing right or wrong? And he goes, do you think everyone learned that way? I'm like, no, I guess not. And he said, what does it say, about mastering something? It takes about 10 years and about 10,000 hours of practice. But you don't have to have someone teaching you. If you have a passion for it and you're practicing with intention to grow, with intention to learn, right? And so I'll get more into that for a moment. But he just reminded me, and my heart kind of sank because he was right. And I don't want to admit that he's right, but he's right. If I have a passion and an interest in it, I should be picking it up and just playing on my own. Learning intentionally in any way that I can. So that I progress, right? Practice is something that, so again, with grit, is the second major part of grit, of endurance, of perseverance. It's practicing. And many people, the greats, actually don't focus on their strengths. They're like, okay, I've got this part, I'm good at it. What are my weaknesses? Which is interesting, because when we teach our kids, right, we're always trying to encourage their strengths. Oh, you did such a great job. That was awesome, And the studies that she was doing was saying that that's not exactly all that beneficial. If instead you say, hey, you did great, but you can improve upon, and you challenge yourself, and you say, okay, now I know where I need to improve upon. And so she was looking, again, at the swimmer who was in swimming, and it's like, okay, well, what could you do better? What they would do, or even performers, when they would perform, it was great getting the praise, but then they're like, okay, now put the praise aside and give me some feedback. How can I improve? What are my weaknesses? Because with that knowledge, now I can go and improve upon them. And so practice is important, so I wrote it down. Then we have to practice, but we must practice deliberately by honing in on our weaknesses and Achilles' heel, setting challenging Stretch goals and incorporating feedback. She mentions that encouragement during this time is crucial, right? Because people are still figuring out, do I want to continue with this or not, or do I want to quit, right? Because if you're going to commit to this, then it needs to be something that's lifelong. And so she was talking about practicing with a gentleman, and she's like, listen, I've been running since I was like 7 or 8 years old. I've run and I've run and I've run. I still run to this day. Why am I not in the Olympics? And he said, okay, well, when you run, how long do you run for? Are you like trying to beat that time? Why are you running? Are you just trying to stay healthy? Are you trying to fit in a certain pair of jeans? Are you like, and when you do it, are you trying to keep a certain heart rate? Are you trying to reach a certain distance? Are you trying to, while you're running, what else like are you doing? And, I listen to some music or, and he was like, well, you're practicing, but you're not deliberately practicing. It's not like you're trying to say, this is my weakness. I want to improve upon. I want to become stronger here. I want to beat my time. Everyone who runs doesn't go to the Olympics, right? You have to run with purpose. You have to eat properly. You have to train. You have to say, I want to beat my time. This is the world record. That means I need to beat that time. That's my goal. I need to train every day to try to beat the time that I have until it beats that time. You have to be incredibly intentional in what you do. And in order to do better, you got to focus on your weaknesses. So it's very interesting. She gives an example of someone who's doing a spelling bee. And she looked at, because her whole thing about grit is that she was testing people. She'd have them do like a quiz to try and understand where they sat with perseverance and how that affected them. And so with the spelling bee idea, every year, she interviewed this girl who had won 4 years in a row. She had 1 year left. And so she had interviewed all the contestants and see, how much do you practice? How do you practice? And though many of them enjoy reading, and you can grow in your vocabulary by reading, it wasn't the same. She found out that the person who won all the time practiced 10 hours a week for the full year and would go through the dictionary. Word by word by word by word. And when she found out she had certain weaknesses in words, she would target those or groupings of words. Why am I not understanding how to spell this? And bring it all together. And so it was deliberate practice, as opposed to some of the other kids who maybe spent 1 month before going on the spelling bee challenge, right? Or this was a girl who dedicated day and night every day to learning how to spell words. It was deliberate, and she focused on her weaknesses. And so it's incredibly important. And then, what did I put down in there? There's 10 years, 10,000 hours is how long they say it takes to master something. And then it says, how does it feel to deliberately practice? Attempting to do what you cannot yet do is frustrating, uncomfortable, and even painful. Again, you can see why interest and passion is so important, because that's a little bit of what's going to help build you. Then it also is important to have someone that says, okay, you need to push through this uncomfortable moment. You can get over this. You want to get better, right? We're not going to be perfect at everything, so let's pick the parts that we're not so good at, but let's improve them. And you learn grit. You learn perseverance, right? And you need a clearly defined goal. Like I said, not everyone who runs makes it to the Olympics. You have to have a goal, concentration, effort, and you need moments to reflect upon the feedback that's given. All right, I think I got that. So I loved reading this chapter, especially when she started talking about running, because I'm in Hebrews, and I know the verse about running and the way it talks about running, because it talks about all the same things that she talked about. It talked about having a goal, a very specific goal that you're running towards. It talks about the suffering that you go through, the refinement process, the discipline that it takes to go through, and that comes and that hurts. And I know I've preached it before, but since it's my essay anyway. Sometimes you're running uphill. Sometimes there's ruts in the road. Sometimes other people trip you up. Sometimes when he's talking about a race, it's not a 100-meter dash. It's a lifelong journey. And with that comes, you're like run after not having run for a long time, you get cramps, right? You get cramps. You get sore. You get pain. It's not easy, but it helps us to grow. It refines us. It begins to perfect us and our faith. And so how do I not quote Hebrews 12 here? Let us strip off every weight that slows us down. Weaknesses, anyone? She was talking about learning your weaknesses and like overcoming them, right? And it's like, throw off everything that slows you down, everything that is holding you back, everything that is, let it go. Especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance, grit, as she puts it, tenacity, which requires a pushing on beyond the struggle. Everything that perseverance is saying that you're going to struggle. No one gets it easy, but it's about pushing through. It's about standing firm. It's about holding on. Let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. What's the goal? God has put it before you. The race that you have should be very specific. You're not running your own race. You're running the one that God has placed before you. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Our eyes on the prize. Our eyes on Christ. Our eyes on, right? And then it says, the champion who initiates, so he's the initial reason why we became who we became, in learning about our identity, right? But then, and perfects our faith. Do you know how your faith grows? By having it tested. By having it tested again and again and again. And Hebrews does a wonderful part. I'm probably skipping ahead of my sermon now. Hebrews does a fantastic part of saying, listen to the greats. Look at how Moses and what he did. Look at Abraham, who had faith to leave everything behind and go to a country that wasn't his own. And then even as he continued to grow there, was like he stayed there by faith. It was by faith that Sarah had a child, even though she was barren, right? It is by faith, and it goes through all the greats to be able to encourage, to be able to sit and say, hey, come on, right? So he perfects your faith, because there are moments. Abraham slept with Hagar first, did you not? Right? He was like, this isn't working out the way God has said, so let me figure this out on my own. I would not want to be Abraham as he goes outside, and God's like, what'd you do? Didn't I tell you that you would? Look at the stars. Can you count them? Right? I wonder if God used an annoyed voice, being like, Abraham, why don't you trust me? I've brought you here. I've allowed you to prosper. I've allowed you to... Why do you not believe the words that I have told you? You think Joseph came to the conclusion, my brothers meant it for harm, but God meant it for good overnight? You think when he was thrown into the pit, left to die, or sold into slavery, he was like, it's all good. God's got this. It wasn't until way later in his life that he's Pharaoh's second in command that his brothers come before him and he's like, oh, I never thought this day would come. What do I do now? And he ends up taking one of them hostage. You stole from me. He orchestrated the whole thing. You think he didn't struggle with the idea of, wait a second, this was God's plan all along, wasn't it? But it didn't come to him right from the beginning, right? God tests us over and over and over again. When he tests us, it's not to belittle us and make us feel like garbage. It's to show us where we fail from. What's in our hearts. Because when you're tested, our hearts are revealed and we're like, oh yeah, I don't like what's in there. But now I have a choice. Do I continue on down my stubborn way, or do I change what's going on in my heart to do what God is asking me to do? He tests you not so that you're pushed on the idea that you failed, but so that you can fix something that's in your heart. Because Abraham, after all his little failings, gets to the point where it's like, so the one son that I finally have, the one of promise, you want me to kill? You want me to sacrifice? Okay, I trust you. You didn't get over there overnight, right? It's the perfecter of our faith. And then it talks about discipline. And so I think about the discipline. 10,000 hours over 10 years requires discipline. That girl who's doing the spelling bee and practicing every single day takes discipline, right? And then the same verse afterwards about running the race talks about God's discipline and how it's good for us. That while our fathers here on earth took the time to discipline us, it created in us right living. And what does God do then as our heavenly Father when he disciplines us? Because that leads into eternal life. And so, I love verse 10. God's discipline is always good for us so that we might share in his holiness. It changes who we are. Holiness, again, means to be set apart, to be different than everything else, right? To be set apart. And so his discipline is changing who we are different than everything else around us. He's making us his. So experts seek weaknesses to strengthen. In our journey, God does the same thing. He tests our faith. He tests who we are so that we grow in endurance, in perseverance, in grit, as Angela puts it. We recognize our weaknesses and are disciplined so that we can grow stronger and overcome, right? The race that we're on, it's not an easy one. There's a lot of obstacles along the way, a lot of pain along the way. But God asks us to overcome, to push through. And when you do, you actually start getting into the habit of overcoming. It's so easy when you begin, and I'll get into this in a little bit as well, but it's easy when you failed to give up, and then later on in life, anytime you might fail at something, it's like, well, there's no point. I can't grow any more than this. This is my fate. I'm done. This is the way it is. But if you're taught at a young age to overcome, that you can, that despite the fact that you fail, that you can pick yourself back up and go, things change later on in life. You grow grit. You grow tenacity, but you need to change your mindset. Hebrews 11:20. It was by faith, so I wrote it down because I figured I'd tell you some of the faith people. It was by faith that Isaac promised blessings for the future of his sons, Jacob and Esau. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child. They were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's just a couple. Like when you read the verses that are in there, it's much, much longer. And it goes into the people of faith. And again, when you think of those people of faith, Samson's one of my favorites just because it's like, my goodness, he failed and failed and failed again. It's great when you read the story that he killed a certain number of people, but when you reach the last sentence of his story, and he killed more in death than in life, it talks about his purpose. His purpose was to fight the Philistines. He didn't. He hung out with them most of the time. And it wasn't until the end that he said, okay, God, let's do it your way. And he prays. You should, like when you read Samson's story, see how often he actually takes the time to pray, right? And it's not till the end that he's like, all right, God, let's do it your way, that he killed more people in death than in life, right? And so it talks about a refining faith in the same way that she talks about, Angela, talks about having to practice over and over and over again. And we're encouraged by people of faith who've done it before us. Okay, third is purpose. Purpose refers to our desire to contribute to making the world a better place and to helping others. I love this because when I think of purpose, I was more in tune with the idea of identity. But here she takes a completely different spin on purpose and talks about how when we find our purpose, how it's not just benefiting us, but true people who have grit, who have perseverance, are looking to benefit people around them. And so there's a cool little poem. There it is. 3 bricklayers were asked what they were doing. The first one said, I'm laying bricks. That's his job. It's necessary. It's what he needs to do in order to survive. I'm a bricklayer. This is my job. This is what I get paid for. That payment allows me to survive. This is just what I'm doing. So his perspective, you guys are all reading ahead. Stop that. He's there, just placing bricks. This is what I do for sustenance. Ask bricklayer number 2, working on the same building. Hey, what are you doing? I'm building a church. That's a little bit more than just I'm doing this to get paid, right? It talks about his career. This is part of who I am. This is what I've chosen to do, but it may not be where I end. This may lead me hopefully to something a little bit better where I don't have to bricklay forever. It's a stepping stone maybe to something a little bit bigger. It's his career, but maybe a stepping stone. The last person who's laying bricks in the same building says, I am building the house of God. Ooh. 3 bricklayers. You ask them a question. Their perspective is everything. Because the person who's building the house of God is not doing it for himself. He's not doing it as a career. He's not doing it. He's doing it for God. It's about calling. It's about being called into something greater. And so when I read this in her chapter, I'm just like, you're brushing upon the very thing. This is exactly what it's about. It's about God calling us into something greater. Because when you serve other people and you're not doing it for yourself, do you know how much more strength you have? You know how easy it is to throw in the towel when all you're doing is serving yourself? It's like, who does this really benefit? Yay. But you have a single mom who's got kids to take care of, and all of a sudden she's working as much as she can possibly can because she's not doing it for herself anymore. She's doing it for her kids. And the strength and tenacity and grit that she has all of a sudden. Now you take someone who's saying, I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this for a greater purpose, to serve my community, to serve the world. And that's how martyrs are born. Because they're willing to die for what they believe in. So she so gently brushes upon the idea of calling. And I'm like, no, go so much more. Go deeper into it. Your book is called Grit. To have endurance, to have perseverance, you need to be doing it for someone else. It gives you immense amount of strength. So again, the author of Hebrews is saying, who are you doing this for? When you run your race, who are your eyes on? Guys, struggles will come, but what gives you the strength to push through it? And he talks about how Christ suffered first. So there's a couple other things that she mentions in her chapter there about purpose. And she talks about how people, she gives examples that people who believe it's a calling, doing what they're doing, miss a lot less work. How most people that are doing it for themselves as a career, or I'm just a bricklayer, they miss a third more work, 33% more work than people who see it as a calling. A third is a pretty big number, okay? And she interviewed this person who started, I can't remember whether they wanted to be a musician or something. They were doing something totally different, and then they were cleaning office buildings. And then as they were cleaning office buildings, they ended up hiring a couple other people. It was a spouse, so together they were doing it. And then they hired some people, and then they opened up a business where they started to provide for most buildings in New York. And it grew into this like big empire of cleaning services, right? And they still, even though they own it all, are still there scrubbing toilets. And it's like, why are you still scrubbing the toilets? Right? And when you hear the response, it's like, it's not about like me. I know that I'm serving something greater. I know that the people that come in here to work, that they have purpose, that they don't make it about themselves and the individual job that they're doing. They make it about the grander thing. How they're making a difference in New York, how they're making a difference in their town, in the different buildings and the services that they provide. And so another example she gives is of this girl named Kat. She worked at Hooters, and she was a server. And one day, the cooks just left. They quit, all of them together. And she's like, the only way I make money is with tips. No one's going to give me tips if there's no food. And so she decided, I'm going to go into the kitchen and cook. And so she started cooking. And when she interviews her, Angela interviews her, is like, so what gave you that? She's like, one, I kind of just wanted to see if I could pull it off. But two, I really needed the money at that point in time. And so she becomes a cook. And then when her manager quits, she becomes the manager. And so slowly, she gets involved with all the operations of the chain, and then the chain starts to open up and says, hey, we'd like to open up in the UK, we'd like to open up in Australia, and she ends up heading that up so that the franchise grows in 27 different countries, all from the idea of, this is bigger than I am, right? I need to serve other people. This isn't just about me, so let me see if I can cook, let me see if I can manage, let me see if I can fill in the gap to something a little bit greater. And so that's one of the examples she gives. And eventually, Kat did like everything, right? But she had tenacity. I don't know, if I was working in a restaurant and all the cooks left, I'd be like, okay, well, if I can't serve anything, I may as well go home. Hey, guys, we're shutting down, right? And that was inspirational for me. It's like, no, she put on an apron and went to cook. She saw a need and went to go take care of that. She had a grander purpose, and she wanted to serve that grander purpose. Hebrews 13, 1-3. Keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers. For some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. Remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. Can you hear about the connection that he's trying to build in you in Hebrews? So I'm loving this because I'm just like, Angela, read Hebrews, right? Because there it is. He's talking about something that you're serving that's greater than yourself. Not only are you doing it for God, but you're also doing it for your brothers and sisters, for those in pain, for those who are suffering, for those who are. And when you do, grit, perseverance grows inside of you because you're doing it to make the world a better place. Who do you serve? The last one, the fourth one, is hope. Even reading the title of this one, I'm like, oh, come on. You're handing this to me on a silver platter. Hope. But she talks about hope. She talks about how they took a whole bunch of dogs. This is heartbreaking for me. I love animals. Had a whole bunch of dogs, and they put on half of them electroshocks on their feet. And they would do that for 5 seconds. For the first group, and they wouldn't, you still got it for 5 seconds on the second group. The first group, if you pushed a panel at the front of your cage, it would stop. The other dogs, you had no choice. You just had to suffer through your 5 seconds, right? And so then, after a couple months of doing this, they put them in a cage that was open and one wall slightly lower. And when the electroshock happened, the dogs that were so used to, I can't do anything about this, would just curl up and just suffer through it. I got 5 seconds. This is what I got to suffer through. Here we go. The other dogs, once they felt it, were like, I can do something about this. I can do something about this. And they were the ones who jumped out, who realized, no, I can get out of here, right? First, obviously, they're looking for a panel to shorten the shock. But then they're like, wait a second, I can get out of this. And they were the ones to jump over the fence. And so then, as you continue on in the chapter, it talks about doing tests on some rats. And what they did, because rats' life cycle is much smaller than our own, so their adolescence about 5 weeks, they did something very similar where if they ran in a ball, the shock would shorten. And then they did the same with the other ones, except they could do nothing about it. And then they waited a full 6 months later just to study how the rats interacted with the world around them. And all the rats that overcame because of the ball, as they grew into adulthood, realized, I can overcome. And so they ended up being pack leaders or alphas in their little nests. They ended up and studying them, while the other ones all ended up with, anytime there was a struggle, they just gave in. A lot of them lived a lot shorter lives. And so it talks about this study, and she goes on to sit and say, when you hit adversity, when you hit struggles, if you have hope that you can overcome, you will. One way or another, you can. She talks about herself going to university, and she was going into neurobiology, and her first test, she failed and was just like, oh my goodness. So she studied and studied and studied, and she went to go get extra help, and the people who said, maybe this isn't for you, you should drop out. Don't get an F and let it hurt your GPA at the end, because it'll be that much harder to graduate. Don't let it do that. You should probably drop out. She's like, no, I got this. She did her midterms and failed. So again, she goes to them, and it's like, oh, come on. And they're like, seriously, you should just drop out. This isn't for you. And she comes to a conclusion and decision herself and says, you know what? Forget this. I'm going to change the way I study. I'm going to take every practice I can. I'm going to go to all the teacher's assistants. I'm going to ask 1 trillion questions until I have this figured out. And when she went for her final exam, she aced it and was like, wow, this ended up being so much easier because I've been practicing and practicing and practicing. Now I've overcome, and here you go. But that gave her tenacity and grit. And she's like, I was like the dogs who overcame. And so she gives the example, and it's just like, so scientifically, because she goes into it, she did a test, again, that she handed out to a whole bunch of people, and she gave these 4 statements and said, if you believe in the first 2, you're grouped over here. If you believe in the second 2, or the last 2, you're grouped over here. And the sentences go like this: your intelligence is something very basic about you that you can't change very much. Statement 2, you can learn new things, but you can't change how intelligent you are. The last two statements are, no matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it quite a bit. Or, and finally, you can always change substantially how intelligent you are. And so they hand this out to thousands upon thousands of people. And for the people who answer the first two, they're like, no, my worldview is I'm only capable of this. I cannot exceed this. This is all I'm able to do. Whereas the other ones say, no, I can always change that. And so when she compares it to what they do as professions and how well they've succeeded and how far they've gone into school and all the other things, it comes to the conclusion that the people who believe in the second or the last two statements are people who have grit, who have tenacity, who when they fail realize, I can change this. So when it talks about hope, I was kind of like, it's about the hard times coming, but it's about overcoming. So just some of the things written that I wrote down as notes from the book. Language is one way to cultivate hope, but modeling a growth mindset demonstrated by our actions that we truly believe people can learn to learn, maybe even more important. And so the rest of the chapter talks about teachers and talking about how teachers interact with children. And it was about a charitable group. They had something like 97 schools in the U.S., all for underprivileged children, and how the teachers interacted with them. And it wasn't just, hey, you did a great job, but it was, hey, you did good here, but you can definitely improve over here and over here. But they taught them they could overcome, that they could do better. And by teaching that in them at such a young age, as they grew and they follow what happens in their lives, it was something like 87% of them went off to college. So that hope that they had was a growth mindset. It was the idea that I'm not limited by anything other than myself. I can choose to grow. I can choose to be more, do more, and I put that one there. Controlling your experiment makes you stronger throughout life. So I was thinking of either the dogs or the rats, and when they took control over what was happening to them, their perspective of the way that they saw it changes everything. Because when difficulties come, and they will come, you can wave the white flag, and like, that's it. I can't do any more than this. But those are the people that do end up failing, right? Because you can learn from failures. Again, when you go through testings, you can choose to grow. You can choose to learn. So it's all about how you overcome and how you view it. And then there was a scientist that very much talked about how people who've gone through trauma at a very young age and overcome, when you look at later on in their lives, they continue to overcome and do something. But kids who go through trauma and give in and say, this is it, I accept the external circumstances that have happened to me, this is my lot in life, this is it, they don't grow anymore. So it takes an immense amount of work with children to remind them and sit and say, don't limit yourself. You can become anything, but you need to overcome. You need to sweat. You need to. Hebrews 10:35. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward that it brings you. Patient endurance. Remember that when it says patience, it could mean long suffering in the Bible. So patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised. Don't throw away this confident trust in the Lord. You hear the hope that he's talking to you about? When we hold on to God, the one who's put us on our path, on our journey, he is our hope. He is what we hold on to. That's why he says in the verse before that we keep our eyes on him. He is what gives us strength. He is what gives us hope to overcome. And there's verses in Hebrews that says, you saw how much he suffered, and he overcame. You're going to suffer too. But remember what he went through, and it'll give you the strength that you need to overcome as well. So faith showed how all the greats of the Bible persevered, but had grit. And it was hope that allowed them to do so. When it talks about all the people of faith, it talks about the hope that they had, that they were not experiencing because they didn't have Christ. We do. Christ has come and died. We have the Holy Spirit inside of us. Everything has changed. But they had hope because they knew there was something greater waiting for them that they would not experience here. They were nomads on earth. They were only here for a little while, and they knew that, and their hope wasn't for what was going to happen here, but what was going to come. That's what gave them the strength that they needed. That's why they persevered. That's why they pushed through. That's why they had grit. Hebrews 11:1, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. Ooh, it's the juice. It's the thing that keeps you going. Hope is like seeing the things around you as they should be, not as they are. Faith is the action that says, now it's time we change it to make it so that it's the way I hope inside. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. So there it is. The 4 different things that she talked about, and I was just like, interesting. Even hope in and of itself. What gives us or should give us our strength is hope. Is pushing through, is not looking at our circumstances and saying, well, this is it. I'm going to take my 5 seconds of electricity here, and that's it, and then I can maybe go on for another hour before it happens again. It's saying, no, there's a way I can stop this. There's a way I can slow this down. There's something else I can do. And you have the power of God with you. You are going to face struggles. Don't let it defeat you. Pay attention to what Christ went through. He suffered. He suffered. Not just physically, and you can focus on that. Being raised Catholic, they focused a lot on the suffering, on the nails that went through his hands, on the whippings and what that did, because it wasn't 40 lashes minus 1. It was until he was exhausted, which was against the law back then. How it tore like the skin and his flesh, so it was like just a mangled mess. And then he had to carry a cross. And he got made fun of and slapped and beat, and a crown of thorns placed on, a robe to be made fun of, and to carry the instrument of his death. That's all the physical stuff. And then there's the spiritual side of things where he's going to be separated from the Father for a moment, which is terrifying. Then there's the idea that the very people you created, your children, are screaming, I wish you were dead. Crucify him. Crucify him. Can you imagine being up there? These are your children that you're willing to die for. And in their hearts, they wish you were dead. And what does he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So, when you keep your eyes on Christ and the hope that he had, the hope he has given us, when you go through what you go through, it's not so bad. Plus, our hope isn't for this life here. It's not for what we're going to attain here. It's for the life to come. And so when you read through Hebrews, it is an encouragement piece to us to endure, to keep our eyes on God, to focus on our weaknesses and overcome them, to grow tenacity, to grow perseverance, to stand firm and strong, knowing that it's going to come. The pains are going to come. To run the race that's set up before us. He encourages and encourages and encourages while we keep hope. And so, like I said, I read through Angela's book, and I'm like, I wish she read Hebrews and saw all the things I do between what she has said and studied for a long period of her life, okay, and what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years already. We need to have an identity in Christ, right? We need to practice. We need to love other people, and we need to practice. Focus on our weaknesses. You know, if you have a problem with anger, realize you have a problem with anger and do something about it, okay? And God will test you on purpose. You're like, oh, that's how you'll overcome. Remember who you're doing it for. Don't be a bricklayer that just does it for pay. Don't be a bricklayer that does it for a career. Be a bricklayer that builds the house of God. And finally, your hope. And so I feel like all of that is in Hebrews. And so they go side by side. All right. That's all I got. Thank you guys for bearing through me with that. I hope you all learned something. I'm going to close in prayer. Just because, I mean, they both have value. And I used to read a novel a day when I was a little kid. My parents wouldn't let me go out and play or interact with other children. I was grounded all the time. There's a whole story involved, testimony. But overall, that meant I was stuck in my room most of my childhood. And so what I would do is I would read. I'd read story after story. About 350 pages a day on average is what I read. I go to the library and pull out like 22 books, and they'd look at me being like, you know you only have 2 weeks, right? I'm like, oh yeah, don't worry. I'll be back to pick up more. Please order this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one for me. And the amazing thing is, so I read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of you are probably scowling at me because I like the idea of wizards and dragons and so forth and so on. It's what I read. But no matter what I read, there was always one thing I had in common, is that there was a protagonist. Is that our hearts always craved for someone, for peace, for justice, for truth, for the best stories I've ever read have always been where someone dies to save someone else. And after all the stories that I've read, I can't help but be like, they all reflect the story of Christ. Inside the depths of who I am, of what's in there, the best that humanity could ever write always reflects God. And so even Angela, she's spent her life studying about tenacity and grit. I can see that the Father in heaven has already placed all of that in there. It's something that we're meant to go through. It's something like we're going to go through struggles and we're meant to overcome. He gives us the strength to overcome. He tests us on purpose so that we can realize our shortcomings, so that we can grow. We can choose growth. And our hope is what fuels us. Our calling is what fuels us. When God has asked something of you, it's like, sweet, now that I know, I've allowed God to transform my mind, and now that I know what I need to do, there's nothing that can stop me, because it is the will of God. I don't do this for me. I do it for Him. And then that's where my hope resides. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. May your will be done on earth just as it is in heaven. And with that as my prayer, there is nothing that can stop me, because it is God's will. Dear Lord, help us to grow in tenacity. Help us to grow in perseverance. Help us to be able to read Hebrews and understand that He is encouraging us that and reminding us that there is all kinds of pains and struggles that happen all around us, towards us all the time, and that's the way it's going to be. But may we hold the hope that it's not about the right now, but it's about what is to come. It is about doing the will of the Father. It's about running our race despite the pain, by being encouraged by the people who came before, who didn't even know Christ the way we do, and persevered. And He encourages us to hold strong. So Lord, would you help us to stand firm, to hold on to the things that you have promised, not just in this life, but the one to come. May our hope grow. May it fuel what we do as we hunger to do your will, Lord. Help us to grow as your children. And when discipline comes, and it does come, oh Lord, may we grow from it. May we not just wave the white flag and be like, that's enough. But may we grow, because it's you who's disciplining us and preparing us for eternal life. God, may our trust in you grow. May we look at your example of suffering and know that it's but a moment in time, and eternity is so much more important, and not just for us, but the people around us. How badly do they need to hear your voice? How badly do they need to learn how much you love them? Lord, I pray for protection as we go about our weeks. Give us great courage and boldness to speak out. Protect us, and then give us opportunity to make a difference in this world, to show perseverance. In Jesus' name I pray. And everyone said, Amen. 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 Thank you. God bless. Yes? Mm-hmm. And you want to shut off the... Thanks.